So it's really no secret that as of late, Square Enix has had a bit of a rough go at it. Some would say that they're in a bit of a pickle right now, but they recently released a financial earnings report that has some rather interesting things to take away from it. But the whole gist of the financial earnings report is to say Square Enix did have a good year, but there are some glaring issues. And the biggest thing is that Square has now realized, and it might be kind of too late, that they need to focus on more than just the Japanese market. They need to have a wide global appeal, not just towards Japan. Now, you could make the argument that back in the day on the PS1, Square was technically appealing to a global market. It wasn't just Final Fantasy. They were taking chances on things like Xenogears, the Chrono Cross and Chrono Trigger franchise, Vagrant Story, and even something like Parasite Eve, which was really different. It wasn't just the standard JRPG kind of thing. They really were trying to create something different that appealed to a wider audience. And if you look at a game like Forspoken, which, regardless of how you feel about the game's marketing, visually and gameplay wise, this could be a game that does appeal to a global audience. Japan is not what it used to be, especially for gaming. You have a lot of people who aren't playing games as much in Japan, and they're relying more on their mobile devices and mobile gaming to just kind of get through the day. Even companies like Sony and Nintendo, who used to do really well over there, are struggling to a degree. Hell, Microsoft never even found their footing in Japan. It's just not gonna happen, man. That ship has sailed. Don't even release the next Xbox in Japan. Just don't do it, Phil Spencer. I know you watch my videos, Phil. I know you're lurking out there. Don't do it. Don't release the next Xbox in Japan. You're just gonna waste yourself some money. Fuck it! They even touch on the fact that their company isn't really growing right now. They've stagnated because of that focus on Japan. And a lot of people are kind of looking at this earnings report and thinking, oh, Square is probably regretting not putting their games on Xbox platforms, or they regret letting go of their Western studios and IPs, but I really don't think that's what Square is talking about here. And the two things I'm taking away from this earnings report is obviously the first one being the most obvious. Square needs to do a much better job of taking their games and having them appeal to a mass audience. Now, they're already kind of on a good track there with things like the Final Fantasy series, Kingdom Hearts, and even to an extent, Dragon Quest. But you look at something like Final Fantasy, it's been traditionally a turn-based RPG over the years. You had Final Fantasy VII in this remake trilogy, which is starting to incorporate more action elements to its game. But you look at a game like Final Fantasy XVI, which seems to be heavily appealing to a much wider market that isn't focused solely on Japan. It doesn't really look like a JRPG. It also doesn't really look like it's going to play like a JRPG. It's much more action influenced, more Western influenced, if you will, from games like Devil May Cry and Bayonetta, which I understand are games that are developed by Japanese studios, but companies like Capcom understand that their games need to have a wide mass appeal. Devil May Cry, for example, again, it's a Japanese developed game and Japanese published, but it appeals to a wide audience, especially here in America. It's not just a straight up JRPG, J-pop kind of thing going on in there. And even visually, Final Fantasy XVI doesn't look like a traditional Final Fantasy game. I've seen some people out there say this. It's kind of like Game of Thrones, where you have all kinds of different looking people that don't just solely look like a J-pop star, you know? We're talking about fantasy, medieval, Lord of the Rings type of shit, man, and it looks really cool. And I think this is going to be one of those games that really does end up appealing to a wide mass market audience. Now, another really good example of this is From Software, a Japanese studio that makes games like Elden Ring, Bloodborne, and the Soul series. These are games that appeal not just to Japan, but the entire world. You look at a game like Elden Ring, which is one of the biggest releases of this year. It might actually be one of the biggest, most important games ever to come out. It's one of those games that actually crossed over into the pop culture zeitgeist. We had late night television shows making Elden Ring jokes. That doesn't happen very often, man. A studio like them have done such a fantastic job of making games that appeal to a global audience. Now, the second and last thing that I'm getting from this earnings report is that it really does kind of sound like Square wants to be bought out by another company. Now, We've talked ad nauseum on this channel with videos from the past about Square Enix looking to be bought out, and how I personally think that if anybody were to do it, it would probably be Sony. They seem to have the most vested interest in Square Enix. They also have a long relationship with Square Enix that dates back to the PlayStation 1 era of things, and they're super interested, clearly, in Final Fantasy. I think it's one of the reasons why the 7 Remake trilogy and 16 are gonna be console exclusive to the Sony platforms. The interesting thing here is that maybe these studios like Sony, maybe even a Microsoft or a Tencent, might not actually be interested in purchasing the entirety of Square Enix, and they might just want certain sections, which is something Square has opened up over the past few months, allowing investors to come in and essentially stake claims to certain developers within the Square Enix studio lineup, which might be something Sony wants to do. Sony seems so heavily interested in Final Fantasy right now, and maybe that's all they care about. Maybe they don't want Kingdom Hearts, maybe they don't want a Dragon Quest type of thing. They just want Final Fantasy. So realistically, Sony could come in, pay Square some money, and have an investment stake in Final Fantasy VII Remake's trilogy, Final Fantasy 16. Maybe that's one of the reasons why those games seem to be console exclusive and will probably remain console exclusive for a very long time. Can't my voice go any higher? And secondly, I know a lot of people would probably say, well, wouldn't this technically interfere with the CMA investigation between Sony and Microsoft, and how Sony is saying that Microsoft buying Activision Blizzard isn't necessarily fair? Probably not. Square Enix, although they're big, is not Activision Blizzard big. They're not Call of Duty big. Call of Duty is a major title across multiple platforms. So Sony coming in and buying a company like Square, I don't think would have an effect on that investigation. It's not like Microsoft is relying on Square Enix. It's not like Microsoft would come out and say, but we rely so heavily on Final Fantasy, that makes our consoles sell. That's not what they're saying. So I don't think that would interfere at all with this CMA investigation. Sony could probably buy Square Enix if they wanted to, and it wouldn't matter really to that investigation. And then of course, Yosuke Matsuda does go on to talk about NFTs and blockchain technology and how that's the future of the company and it's gonna save his business. And Yosuke broske, I gotta tell you, man,
stop it. Get some help.
You need to leave this shit alone. Get out while you still can, man. Focus on your games, focus on your fans, listen to them. They can't really steer you wrong here. So with that being said, I am Curious Corduroy. That is the video. Please leave any of your guys' thoughts in the comments below. What do you think of this earnings report? What do you think about Square's current predicament? Do you think they really need to focus on that global market? And if so, how would you recommend they do it? I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.